Okay, so we are going to talk about simplifying radicals today. So we're just going to go ahead and review square roots before we start this discussion. So remember, a number multiplied by itself is a perfect square. So let's talk about common square roots. The square root of 1 is 1. The square root of 4 is 2. The square root of 9 is 3. 4 times 4 is 16. 5 times 5 is 25. And let's just go ahead and complete the table here. Okay, and we could stop there. We don't really need the other ones. Okay, so we're going to talk about radical expressions. Now, radical expressions are expressions which contain a radical. So, for an example, this is a radical expression where this part is called the radical symbol, and then the number that's underneath is called the radicand. Now, numbers aren't the only things that could be under the radical symbol. We could have stuff that looks like x plus 10. That can be under the radical symbol, where x plus 10 is the radicand. Okay. Now, we can simplify radical expressions using multiplication and properties of square roots. So, if I have a square root, and it's really just two numbers being multiplied together, I can break this apart into the radical of a times the radical of b, where a and b are just numbers. Now, let's look at the number square root of 48. Now, one way that we could break up 48 is 16 times 3 is 48. So I could split up square root of 48 into the square root of 16 times the square root of 3. However, I actually do know what the square root of 16 is. The square root of 16 is 4. So that's 4 radical 3. Okay? So 4 radical 3 is a simplification of the radical of 48. Okay? Now we're going to go through a couple of examples to show you how to get that simplification done. Okay. So on the next page, I gave you a table on the top for reference. And then here, we're going to simplify these radical expressions. So the way we're going to do this is I have the radical 160. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look on the left, and I'm going to try to find the biggest number. These are the ones I'm looking for. You're going to look which of these numbers, which of these are perfect squares. Which is the biggest perfect square that can go into 160? Well, let's look at all of these numbers. I know it can't be bigger than 160, so I have to look at something that is along here. Now, 160 divided by 2 is 80, so it can't be anything greater than 80. It has to be less than 80, so it's one of these numbers. If I look, the one that's really obvious is the square root of 16, right? 16 times 10 is 160. So I could separate 160 into 16 times 10. So I'm going to break this up into the radical of 16, radical 10. And I know radical 16 is 4. So this ends up being 4 radical 10. Okay. Now look at letter B. B is radical 72. Now I have to look at the biggest number that can go into 72. Now I know 9 can go into 72 because 9 times 8 is 72. But you should always see, is there something bigger? Well, ask yourself, what is 72 divided by 2? 72 divided by 2 is 36, and that's one of the numbers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break up square root of 72 into radical 36, radical 2. However, I do know what the radical of 36 is, and it's 6. I can't break up the radical 2 anymore, so it stays like that. So it's 6 radical 2. Okay, now let's go to the radical of 125. So I asked myself, what is the biggest number that can go in there? Well, if I look, the one that's obvious is 25. 25 times 5 is 125. So this is radical 25 times the radical of 5. But I know the radical of 25 is just 5. So this is 5 radical 5. Okay. Okay, so let's go on to letter D. Letter D, I have the square root of 300. Once again, I look at all of these numbers, and what is the biggest one? It's 100. 100 times 3 is 300. So this is going to break up into the square root of 100, square root of 3. But I know what the square root of 100 is. It's 10. So this is 10 radical 3. Okay, now this is where you would pause the video to kind of try to see, to do the next ones on your own. So just pause the video and wait for the students to finish and resume video when they're done. Okay, so let's check your answers. The square root of 99 is really, the biggest number that can go into 99 is 9. And then so the square root of 9 is 3. So it's 3 radical 11. Now if I look at 88, if you look at it, you probably have to play around with this a bit. 88 divided by 2 is 44. And look at the numbers that are less than 44. 36 can't go into 88, 25 can't, 16 can't. So I think the only one that is able to go in is 4. So this is radical 4, radical 22. And so the answer here should be 2 radical 22. Okay. Letter C hopefully was easier. The largest number that can go into 27 is 9 out of the perfect squares. So this is radical 9, radical 3. Radical 9 is 3. So it's 3 radical 3. Okay. Then letter D, square root of 75. The biggest number on the left that can go into this is 25. So this should just be 5 radical 3. Okay. So now let's move on to check your work if you need to copy it down. And then let's go ahead and move on to example 2. Okay. So you want to simplify the following radical expressions. So what we do is we are just going to look at the square root. So nothing happens to the 6 here. So I'm going to leave the 6 here, and I'm going to break up the radical 18. The largest number that can go to 18 in the left is 9, so this breaks them into radical 9. Radical 2. Radical 9 is 3, so this turns into 6 times 3 radical 2, and so my answer here is 18 radical 2. Okay. So let's try that again. Let's try negative 2 square root of 54. So now I leave the negative 2 there. And now I ask myself, what is the largest number that I can go into 54? Well, if I look here, let's see, is it 16? 16 times 4 is 64, so that's not it. 9. So this breaks up into the square root of 9 is the biggest number. And I know the square root of 9 is 3, so this is negative 2 times 3 times radical 6. So this is negative 6 radical 6. Sorry about that. Okay, so it's just like the previous problems, except that you have a number in front that you have to multiply by. So go ahead, pause the video, and have the students work on the DIY. Okay, so 3 radical 20. The largest number that can go into 20 is 4. The radical 4 is 2, so this is 3 times 2 radical 5. That's 6 radical 5. And then for B, negative 10 radical 8. Negative 10, the largest number that can go into 8 is radical 4. And I'm left with radical 2. Radical 4 is just 2, so this is negative 10 times 2, radical 2. And so my final answer here is negative 20, radical 2. Okay? Okay, so now we're going to move on to this part where we are going to talk about variables. Now, let's see what happens when we square variables and powers of variables. So if I have x times x, remember when we multiply with the same base, I just add the exponents. This is x squared. If I have x squared times x squared, hold on. So I'm squaring x squared times x squared. The answer is x to the 4th. Let's do x to the 3rd. X to the 3rd times x to the 3rd. I add the exponents, that's x to the 6th. So look what happens here. X times x is x squared. That means if I go in the reverse direction, the square root of x squared is just x, right? Remember how 5 times 5 is 25, so the square root of 25 is 5. That's the same thing that's happening here. So here, the square root of x to the 4th is x squared. And here, the square root of x to the 6th is just x to the 3rd. Okay? So what this really means is that if I have an power which has an even exponent, the square root, you just have to divide the exponent by 2. So just a couple more examples. Radical of, let's pick a big number, f of 42, x of 42, is really just x to the 21st power. Okay, it's just half that, because x to the 21st times x to the 21st is x to the 42. So we're going to use that to do example 3. So look at example 3. First number is p to the 14th. P to the 14th, the square root is just going to be p to the 7th. F to the 22, the square root is just f to the 11th. Now this is where it becomes a little more challenging. So I have square root of x to the 13th. Now, I can't this is an odd number, so it doesn't follow it just like how these even numbers did. The way we're going to do it is just the same way we do the numbers. We're going to break this up into two things. Remember, x to the 12th times x is x to the 13th, right? 12 plus 1 is 13. And we actually know what the square root of x12 is. It's x to the 6th. And I can't do anything with the square root of x, so I leave it as radical x. Okay. So once again, what I do is I just remove one y from here. And I'm left with y to the 30th. Okay? So this is radical y to the 30th, radical y. And radical y to the 30th is y to the 15th. And I can't do anything with the radical y, so it stays radical y. Okay? So let's do a couple more examples. Now, if I have a number and a variable, we could, we have to do the number and the variable separate. So square root of 200, ignore that the variable is there right now. If I have the square root of 200, it's what I did before. What is the largest number that I can go into 200 from those perfect squares, right? And if you see, the largest number is 100. 100 times 2 is 200. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break this up into radical 100, radical 2, and then x squared. Okay? Now, I actually know what radical 100 is. It's 10. I don't know what radical 2 is, so I'm going to leave it like that. But I do know what radical x squared is. Radical x squared is just half of that, which is just x. And then I put radical 2. It's customary in math to write it in this way where the radical goes last. So technically, if you write 10 radical 2 x, it's not wrong, but it's just, this is the way you're going to see it. Because sometimes you'll get confused and you'll think the x is under the radical when it's not. So everything that's outside, put it to the left, and everything that's still inside, we put it to the right. So let's look at the square root of 150 x to the 11th. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break up 150. The biggest number that can go into 150 is 25. It's 25 times 6 is 150. And now I have x to the 11th. X to the 11th is not an even number. So we're going to break it up into x to the 10th, square root of x. Okay? Now, which ones here can we simplify? Radical 25 is 5, and radical x to the 10th is x to the 5th. So this is 5 x to the 5th, and whatever cannot be simplified will go under the radical. So it's 5x to the 5th, radical 6x. Okay, let's look at letter G. 128 m to the 7th, n to the 5th. Now 128 might be a little harder to do, but first thing, if you don't know, always divide it by 2. 128 divided by 2 is 64, which is one of the numbers here, right? 64. So this becomes radical 64, radical 2. Now, I have two variables here, m to the 7th. I'm going to break that up into m to the 6th. And I have one m left over. And then my n to the 5th, I'm going to break it up into n to the 4th n. So it's a really long chain. But which ones can I simplify? The 64, the m to the 6th, and the n to the 4th. So this is 8 m to the 3rd, because the square root of m to the 6th is m to the 3rd. Square root of n to the fourth is n squared. And whatever wasn't simplified goes inside here. So I have the 2, the m, and the n left over. Okay? So that is those answers. So I want you to take some time, pause the video, and let the students work. And when they're ready, resume the video. Okay. So the answers for DIY, A is m to the 8th. B is k to the 100. C, we're going to split up p to the third. It's an odd number. So what I do is I do p squared p. And so my answer is just p radical p. Letter D, the radical of t to the 25th is t to the 24th. Radical t. Remember, when it's odd, you just take away 1, and you're left with 24. And then half of this is 12, so this is t to the 12th. Radical t. Letter E is, sorry, here's D if you didn't get it. T to the 12th, radical t. Letter E, largest number that can go into 45 is 9. So this is radical 9, radical 5. X to the 6 is even, so we know how to do that. This is 3. Radical x to the 6 is x to the third. And the 5 stays on the inside. Okay. Letter F, 50, m to the 7th. This is radical 25, radical 2. M to the 7th, I take out 1, so I'm left with m to the 6th and m. And so this is 5, and that's m to the third. And so this is 2m. That can't be simplified. Okay, and then letter G, 500 is really just radical 100, radical 5. And then I'm going to separate g to the 10th into just g to the 10th because it's even. And since it's h to the 11th, I get h to the 10th, h. Okay. So this is 10. That's g to the 5th. That's h to the 5th. So that's 10, g to the 5th, h to the 5th. And whatever I can't simplify goes under, which is 5h. Okay. So now we're going to go into multiplying. If you multiply square roots, you can just go ahead and if they're both radicals, you can just multiply the things that are inside. So this just becomes radical 6. And always ask yourself, can I simplify that? You can. Okay. This one's not under a radical, so we just put it together. 5 radical 2. This one, you just multiply the numbers that are outside the radical. So this is 8 radical 3. Letter D now, let's actually think about this. This is radical 12. But whenever you get this, you should always ask, can I simplify this? And yes, you can, because 4 is a number that can go into here. Okay? So the radical 4 is 2. So it's 2 radical 3. And then for letter E, I have, if I multiply this, this becomes negative 6 radical 63. And then so what I do here is I find the biggest number that can go into 63, which is 9. So this is radical 9, radical 7. And so this becomes negative 6 times 3, radical 7. And that's negative 18, radical 7. Okay. Letter F. Look, you can do radical 18, but it's kind of easier to just look at radical 9 and say that's 3. Yeah, 3 radical 2. Okay. And then the last one, I multiply 6 and 18, so that's 3 radical 108. And so now I ask myself, what is the largest number that can go into 108? And if I look at this list, I think it's probably 16. Or is it 36? It's 36. 36 times 3 is 108. So this is square root of 36, 3, and then the square root of 36 is 6. So this is just 3 times 6, radical 3. So my answer here is 18, radical 3. Okay. So now I want you to try the next ones on your own. So pause the video and then resume when you're ready. Okay. So here are the answers. This one should be 6 radical 6. This one's radical 10. You can't simplify this, so it stays there. Radical 8, radical 5 is radical 40. Thanks. Largest number that can go into there is 4. So this is radical 4, radical 10. So this is 2 radical 10. Letter D. This becomes 4 radical 24. Largest number that can go into 24 is 4. So this is 4 radical 6. And this is 4 times 2 radical 6. So this is 8 radical 6. Okay? So look at that one if you weren't able to get that. Okay? Letter E, square root of 25 is 5, so this is just 5 radical 6. And letter F, I have negative 2 times 4 is negative 8. 6 times 8 is 48. Largest number that can go into 48 is 16. And so this is negative 8 times 4 radical 3. And so this is just negative 32 radical 3. Okay? So if you need to, you could review the video if you need to. But just remember, the whole concept is what is the largest number that can go into the radical. Okay? So now you just work on the assignment that's going to be passed out to you. And you can use the video for your help.